Great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Griffin. I'm the Executive Director at the Foreign Policy Initiative, along with the Arms Control Association. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our conversation today, Worth Deferring, a Sino-Japanese plutonium production race. In just a minute, I'll be handing off to Kingston Reef, who's the Director for Disarmament and Threat Reduction Policy at ACA, and we'll be introducing our speakers and moderating the conversation. I just want to take a quick moment, though, to point out that a couple of developments that are happening out there in the real world this week that I think speak to the salience of the conversation that we're going to be having today. First, tomorrow, I think we all know that an arbitration panel is going to be issuing a ruling on developments in the South China Seas, particularly a disagreement between the Philippines and China there. A lot of us are going to be focusing on the dispute in the South China Seas, what happens after the arbitrary panel issues its ruling. But it's important to keep in mind that while this is going on, also in the East China Sea, that there have been some developments worth paying close attention to. So for example, in spring and summer so far this year, Chinese aircraft, of course, China disputes Japan's administration of the Senkaku Islands, what China calls the Diaoyutai Islands. China has intruded into the airspace surrounding those islands so many times that Japan has dispatched its own aircraft in response at a rate that's twice of what they saw last year. Last month, a Chinese military ship entered into territorial waters surrounding those islands for the first time so far in the context of this dispute. And this is really worth bringing to mind because it's the context of this very important discussion about the future of proliferation, non-proliferation within the region, where we do have growing tensions between China, which of course is advancing its nuclear capabilities, and Japan, which I think will be a good portion of the discussion today, certainly enjoys some latent nuclear capabilities. It's also worth keeping in mind that Thursday will mark the first anniversary since the conclusion of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action between Iran and its negotiating partners, which of course include the United States, surrounding its nuclear deal. We don't have the time or the intention today to have a full discussion or debate about the context of this anniversary, but it's important to keep in mind that one thing that this certainly marks is Iran's progression in time toward the later years of this deal, when it will have virtually unlimited capacity to enrich and reprocess in accordance with that agreement's terms. This is significant for today's conversation because in the context of these negotiations, Iran repeatedly mentioned that the capabilities it seeks are the capabilities that a country like Japan has. In terms of intent, I think this analogy is basically laughable. Japan's a member in good standing of the non-proliferation regime. It has an open and free society. It's allied with the United States. It's a responsible actor in world affairs. However, it speaks to the fact that in reality, Japan has that latent nuclear capacity. China, its neighbor, is advancing its nuclear capabilities. Both of these countries are surrounded by neighbors that, if they made the decision, could develop their own nuclear program within months or years. And this comes at a time when there's a debate in the United States about the value of our alliance commitments in the region, and even our commitment to non-proliferation there. So this is a time where these are really important topics to discuss, where there are very real and significant developments in the region that have implications for them, and of course they have implications for the rest of the world. With that, I once again thank the Arms Control Association for co-hosting today's briefing, and welcome Kingston to moderate what I'm sure will be an informative and great discussion. Thank you, Kingston.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. As Chris mentioned, my name is Kingston Reef, and I'm the Director for Disarmament and Threat Reduction Policy at the Arms Control Association here in Washington, and I'll serve as the moderator for this afternoon's discussion. And let me echo Chris and welcome you to today's lunch forum, which we've titled Worth Deferring, a Sino-Japanese Plutonium Production Race. As you may know, and as Chris hinted, the Foreign Policy Initiative and the Arms Control Association are not always on the same side on important nuclear weapons risk reduction matters. But the subject of today's discussion is not one of those times. The forum's focus, the emerging so-called peaceful nuclear rivalry between these East Asian states, has yet to grab headlines for the full attention of our government. FPI and the Arms Control Association agree that that is a mistake. Japan has already accumulated about 11 metric tons of separated plutonium on its soil, enough to make roughly 2,500 nuclear bombs. It also plans late in 2018 to open a nuclear spent fuel reprocessing plant at Rokkasho that could separate enough plutonium from spent reactor fuel to make an additional 1,500 nuclear weapons annually. These plans have raised concerns in Beijing. However, China's new 5-year plan includes a proposal to import a reprocessing plant from France with the same capacity. South Korea, meanwhile, insists that it should have the same right to separate plutonium as Japan. Congress has an important role to play in the plutonium future of the region, though to date, with a few exceptions, and we'll discuss some of those exceptions today, has yet to really raise its oversight voice. Last year, Congress approved, or rather did not disapprove of, new 123 agreements with China and South Korea, which depart in significant ways from their successors. In addition, the initial 30-year term of the U.S.-Japan 123 agreement expires in July 2018, and the two states must shortly decide whether to allow it to remain in force, which will happen if no action is taken, or to renegotiate it. To clarify what's at stake and what might be done to reduce the risk of a dangerous buildup of separated plutonium in East Asia, the Arms Control Association and Foreign Policy Initiative have assembled this esteemed expert panel. Our first speaker this afternoon will be Gordon Oehler, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency's Nonproliferation Center under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And he will focus on the regional and security and military implications of Japan, China, and South Korea proceeding with the production of civilian plutonium. Second, we'll have Mark Holt, a specialist in energy policy at the Congressional Research Service, and he will discuss current legislation in Congress affecting this issue, such as S. 3010 and H.R. 5370. This legislation, sponsored by Senators Ed Markey and Marco Rubio on the Senate side, and Representatives Brad Sherman and Jeff Fortenberry on the House side, will condition China's possible production of commercial plutonium. And finally, our third speaker, and immediately to my right, will be Henry Sokolski, the Executive Director of the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center and former Defense Department Deputy for Nonproliferation Policy under George H.W. Bush. And he will focus his remarks on how a pause in commercial plutonium activities in East Asia might be achieved. I've asked each speaker to provide about 8 to 10 minutes of opening remarks, after which we'll open it up to all of you for your questions. With that, take it away, Gordon. It's up to you.
Well, it's better for the audience.
All right. Let's see.
Okay, thank you. Is it active? Okay, good. Thanks for the opportunity to come here today. It's good to be back into the proliferation business, even if only in a very small way. The bio that I just saw here tells more about me than you'd ever want to know, but I want to add one little tidbit to that. I joined the CIA long ago because I was a technologist interested in technology. And when I started, all significant technology, advanced technology developments were in our classified programs or the Soviet classified programs. So it gave me a good view of all of that. And that's kind of continued through what I've done during the years. The first part of my presentation today, I want to focus on two proliferation cases that you're both familiar with, but the point that I want to make here in these contrasting situations is the role of the U.S. government, where it works, where it doesn't work, why it works, why it doesn't work. I think you'll find that the role of the U.S. government is pivotal in this. There isn't anybody else that's going to be able to step up to this. The first program I'd like to discuss is the North Korean nuclear weapons program, and this was really an eye-opener for me. In short, we knew about the North Korean nuclear program for many, many years. We reported that they had an end-to-end nuclear weapons program at Yongbyon, and this consisted of an operating graphite-moderated reactor, which is well designed for plutonium production. They also had a building under construction that had characteristics of a fuel reprocessing plant. thick walls. There were a lot of other things that went into that at the same time. And they had a larger graphite moderated reactor under construction. And we could see the startup of the reactors and so forth. What was the response with all of these years of reporting to the U.S. government? Is to ignore it. And in essence, I call it the nuclear mafia at the State Department refused to accept that this was a nuclear weapons program. I think because they didn't want to admit any weaknesses in the NPT. Nobody's going to want to agree that NPT isn't perfect. So here's what happened. The plutonium production reactor rather, they insisted it be called a research reactor. You didn't dare talk about it as a production reactor. And the reprocessing facility, which was located next to the production reactor in a heavily defended nuclear complex at Yongbyon, had to be called, they wanted to call a commercial calcium carbide plant. So nothing harmful there. So nothing ever got done as far as the U.S. government in trying to stop this. This went on for years, and finally when the U.S. government stepped in was when the reporting showed that the reactor shut down, that the reprocessing facility had probably started up, and then a little later than that, that the North Koreans were taking out nuclear waste and burying it and concealing it on the facility to try to hide it from any inspectors that might be coming in. This attracted a lot of attention. The government set up a meeting of the IAEA, the full IAEA, to present all of this evidence, and it was very damning. But you know what? It was too late. It was not possible to stop the program at that point. The only friend of the North Koreans, of course, was China. Now we know that China knew all about this program, but they chose not to do anything. And the U.S. didn't press it as a diplomatic matter, so nothing happened. So look where we are now. There's not much you can do about this. It's not a major program in terms of hundreds of nuclear weapons or anything, but given its location in South Korea and their developing missile capabilities, it clearly is a problem. Second case I'd like to talk about is the 1992 Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. As you know, the Soviet Union had always been a target for nuclear materials struggling in illicit sales. The reason for this is that the Soviet nuclear controls over materials and so forth was done by the services, GRU, and the strong military complex. And that was the way that they controlled access and any penalties if someone did something wrong on this. The U.S., on the other hand, as you know, depends more on fences and safes and locks and sensors. And so we had a very different view of how that goes. But because of those different views, and because when the wall fell in 1989, there was a lot of concern. The chaos in the military and civilian law enforcement officials was such that they would lose control of these nuclear materials. And reports came in that were, at least speaking for myself, really a surprise when we found out how many facilities there were in the Soviet Union and the former states of the Soviet Union that in fact had highly enriched uranium. It was far beyond anything we'd imagined. So this put the whole program in a very different light, and it brought in the cooperation in terms of sensors and security and the involvement of the nuclear labs. And add to that then the deactivation of Soviet strategic missiles, strategic and tactical missiles, was bringing a lot of highly enriched uranium back out. And so what do we do with all of this? And that's where the Nunn and Lugar Cooperation Threat Program came in. In my view, it's no doubt the largest and most significant threat reduction program to date. The Senate was very much involved, as the two senators' names are on there. As I mentioned, the DO labs, who were lab-to-lab discussions, and lots of other portions of the intelligence community and other parts of the government played a role in this whole thing. As I say, it was really, really a successful program because the U.S. government gave such attention to it, brought in all the players. So I can't emphasize enough that the pivotal role of the U.S. in addressing proliferation-related issues. If the U.S. government steps into it, it's probably going to, if they're serious about it, it's probably going to work. If they don't, nobody else is going to step into it. So this brings to the civilian reprocessing quandary that we have today. As you all know, the reprocessing capability has been around since the early nuclear weapons days. No mystery. Most of the technologies, even though the processing itself in the early days was for nuclear weapons program, most of the technologies have been around forever. So why is this a program now? Well, several reasons. One of the biggest reasons, in the past, the countries that wanted to develop nuclear capabilities had to go to the advanced nuclear countries to get the technology. And basically just get the technology and sometimes equipment in order to do it. And the strong NPT really put a condition on it that if they do get into nuclear weapons programs, they swear off reprocessing because of the obvious concern about developing into a nuclear weapons programs. So now we need to ask, are these projected reprocessing programs we're talking about today really purely about future energy needs? And I think in East Asia it's obviously not. Historical regional animosities here are drivers that will not go away for decades. Just as the Japanese cutoff from oil supplies was a factor in their decision to enter World War II, I think you can see that Chinese expansionism into the South China Sea is driven in part by China's need to feed its restive people. If you look into China's need for food, you find that the food prices, the market is completely unstable. And they look out over the South China Sea and see that 10% of the world's fish population is there, and that can be a major help in keeping their restive population in check. Similarly, the race to the bottom in the currency devaluations among China, Japan, South Korea are very competitive programs, and these things are not going to end well, as no currency devaluation program does. They can take a long time, decades, but you see the beginnings of that now. Abenomics in Japan, I think if you read anything about it, is a complete disaster. Did you see Bernanke is now was going to talk to Abe about helicopter money, and that's got the markets all excited, I guess. Most macroeconomics say that China, with this massive debt problem, is going to have a real crash, and you see indications of that once in a while when the renminbi gets devalued a bit, and the impact that has on the Chinese and on other places in the world. South Korea has its own economic problems and will not want to be the one left standing with a strong export limiting currency, so they're participating in the rush to the bottom as well. And all of these problems are really quite intractable. They're going to be around for many years to come. So you got to ask yourself, given where it looks like things are going, the economic situation in the world is not good. The advanced countries are not going to be expanding the way they have been in the past. You have to ask, what is the need for all of this now, especially when you see that uranium is so cheap, and some of the technologies for things like breeders are progressing a lot slower than what people would have thought. So I think the declining needs really should bring to question the risk of going to bigger proliferation systems, perhaps even bigger than the one that Nunn-Lugar faced. And so this is something that policymakers need to face, but it's pretty clear that if they don't make a conscious decision here, an unconscious decision will be made, and that's not probably going to be good. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gordon, for setting that worrisome scene for us. We'll now move to Mark.
All right, thanks for the opportunity today to talk a little bit about legislation involved in today's topic, which would be focused on reprocessing in China. And so CRS, of course, as most people here know, does not support or oppose any specific legislation. We do not advocate policy, so we try to remain as neutral as possible. So I'll describe the legislation that's involved in this topic, and it is not necessarily a CRS position on it. But in our search for bills related to reprocessing in China, there really are, as mentioned, only two main ones that directly address the topic. That would be the House and Senate versions of the U.S.-China Nuclear Cooperation and Nonproliferation Act of 2016, which is S-3010, as mentioned introduced by Senator Markey, co-sponsored Senator Rubio, and then in the House, H.R. 5370 by Representative Sherman and co-sponsored by Representative Fortenberry, and both were introduced May 26, 2016. They're very, very similar. There are some differences, but for the most part, they have the same thrust. In particular, there's some findings related to reprocessing in China that are the same in both bills, so I'll just briefly summarize what they're saying that are of relevance today. One of the proposed findings is that civilian reprocessing could produce plutonium that could be diverted to weapons. Another is that Energy Secretary Moniz was quoted in the press as saying that Chinese reprocessing would not be helpful to U.S. nonproliferation efforts. And then the third is that Chinese commercial reprocessing would encourage reprocessing in other East Asia countries, specifically Japan and Korea. There's also a proposed sense of Congress resolution. This is sort of the fundamental action item that's being urged, is that the U.S. should encourage East Asian countries to forego reprocessing. So that should be the proposal in the bill is that this be a specific U.S. policy goal. So as far as the key actual provisions of the bill that would affect the topic today, specifically would be on requirements for implementing U.S. reprocessing consent rights in China. And that requires a little bit of background. Of course, I'm not sure that the level of knowledge of the group, we're even talking about reprocessing, which basically means to separate plutonium and uranium from spent fuel taken out of commercial reactors. And of course, plutonium is a material that can be used for both weapons and for making nuke civilian fuel. So that's why we're so concerned about it. In the current U.S.-China so-called 123 agreement, that's a peaceful nuclear cooperation agreement that took effect after some controversy but no congressional action in November of 2015, in Article 6, specifically grants U.S. consent for reprocessing, or as the term of art is, alteration in form or content of nuclear material transferred pursuant to this agreement and nuclear material used in or produced through the use of material or equipment so transferred. Basically meaning that any uranium or other nuclear material directly transferred to China cannot be altered in form or content, or in other words, no plutonium can be separated from it, or any material that is produced in U.S. supplied reactors or for use in U.S. supplied reactors cannot be reprocessed. Can be reprocessed. Cannot be reprocessed without U.S. consent, and U.S. consent is explicitly granted. So we granted that consent. However, there's a caveat that the reprocessing of this U.S. origin material must take place in facilities that are safeguarded by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the international UN agency that is charged with preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons and encouraging the peaceful use of nuclear energy. However, if that's IAEA, if IAEA safeguarded facilities are not available, or there's insufficient capacity, which could be the case in the case of China, which it is a weapons state already recognized by the Nonproliferation Treaty as such, reprocessing may be done at facilities that are made eligible for such safeguards upon written agreement from both sides. This essentially means that China would make a voluntary offer to the IAEA for certain facilities to be safeguarded. The section, these bills go on to say that, and this is also very significant as we heard about the concern about stocks of plutonium, the agreement allows reasonable working stocks of safeguarded plutonium to be maintained for civil nuclear operations without defining that. So back to the bills now that we have that background. So the requirements in the bills are mostly in Section 9 of S3010 and Section 10 of HR 5370. They don't change the agreement, but they do set some requirements on U.S. implementation of the agreement, which can be done and has been done in the past. Sorry, a little bit of hoarseness today. So it says the President may not agree to allow U.S. obligated spent fuel to be reprocessed in non-IAEA safeguarded facilities unless the President certifies to certain congressional committees that the following: that the President has formally requested IAEA to safeguard the facility, that IAEA rejected the request for safeguards, and that the U.S. spent fuel sent to such facilities must not be commingled with other nuclear spent fuel stored in separate facilities, clearly marked as U.S. obligated nuclear material, must be available for immediate inspection without prior notice. And it says, both bills, the arrangements and procedures agreed to by the President, these are not quotes, but my summary, must be sufficient to detect in a timely manner the diversion of U.S. obligated material for military purposes or transfer to unapproved facilities. So the President has to be assured that all of these things are going to happen before granting agreement to China as required for the reprocessing in non-IAEA safeguarded facilities. And then there's quite a number of requirements for what these certifications have to have, including the facilities to be used, the safeguards to be applied, the amount of material, the amount of plutonium that may be stockpiled, again, an important point, and risk to U.S. national security from diversion. There's also an important section in the bill that's relevant to this discussion today about the definition of U.S. origin technology, which is fundamental to understanding what material is going to be covered by this requirement for reprocessing in IAEA facilities. That term is not defined, so the bill requires the Department of Energy to issue a definition with some requirements for the definition, such as it must include items that are developed by U.S. persons or persons subject to U.S. jurisdiction, developed with the participation of the U.S. government, including large passive light water reactors, which would essentially be the Westinghouse AP1000 technology that's being transferred to China pursuant to the agreement and the original agreement, and anything derived from U.S. origin technology. So with that, I will stop because we have a very limited time, but that's a brief description of what the legislation out there that's relevant to our discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. And there'll be an additional opportunity in the Q&A if you would like to try and further download from Mark's incredible amount of knowledge.
5 more pages.
Great. Henry.
First, I think it bears repetition that I think this is the first event I've ever remembered where the Arms Control Association and the Foreign Policy Initiative are co-hosting. And it is perhaps in an older tradition of actually caring about the substance rather than who's going to win. We need to get back to that. Now, I suppose because it's an election year, it wouldn't be appropriate to talk about anything unless the word Trump was used once. And I think we owe him a favor. He, after all, has thrown out for consideration that the spread of nuclear weapons in South Korea and Japan is inevitable, and we ought to get on the right side of this juggernaut and make the best of it. Instead of resisting it, perhaps we should facilitate it. Now, I suppose the agreement amongst reasonable people and observers is that at the very least, in time, their acquisition of nuclear weapons is likely. Russia has them, China has them. Why wouldn't North Korea has them? Just stands to reason. There's a trend going on here. Mature states get these things. However, I think it's probably at least as mistaken to assume that what's likely is inevitable. I think there are a lot of reasons why these two countries have not gotten nuclear weapons. Those reasons can be fortified and maintained. If, as Mr. Oehler pointed out, we don't do certain things, however, maybe Mr. Trump is right. So, wait long enough to hold a hearing or write a story on the basis that, well, they got them, and it's exciting, but not very useful. And we have fallen increasingly in the grip of after-sight and after-action battle reports instead of anticipation and deflection at a low cost. So, comments in that regard. Now, there is a piece, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists piece, not mine, which of course is brilliant, but I won't bore you with that. Fumi Yoshida came all the way to the United States. I think he's here today. Is he here? There he's very modest. Wrote an excellent piece. I recommend it. What he pointed out is that it isn't as though the United States hasn't hinted at what its desires are in this area. It has said through the National Security Advisor, John Wollstall, in a Japanese interview, well, if you should choose not to reprocess, we would back that decision. I think Mr. Countryman's quoted in your article pointing out that he would prefer that Japan and China, or for that matter, no country, reprocess. And even the chairman, Mr. Corker, has pointed out that he thinks a pause is totally logical. He can't understand why this hasn't happened. Now, what's interesting in this article, and I'd like to just read a few lines, is so far, Japan's leadership has not reacted to these calls. Why have they shown such insensitivity? They have made clear that they don't consider any of these statements to constitute an official request by the U.S. government, dismissing them as little more than private musings. There are many different views in Washington policy circles, they say, also noting quite correctly that none of the comments from Washington has been followed by concrete actions. I think the only thing that should have been even made clearer in this article that I know in private conversations, and it's hinted at in the piece, is if the United States, according to Mr. Shida, he gave a talk, presented this, you can go see this, so I'm not saying anything out of school. If the United States should make it clear that Japan going ahead will complicate and make more difficult our ability to be a security ally for Japan, then almost certainly the program will not move forward. Just as clearly, though, if we don't say that, it will. In the case of China, things are a little more complicated. Now, I spent 2 years traveling to Asia. I do not recommend that. It is really excruciating, just the physical wear and tear. But when you get there, people are very interesting and all willing to talk. I think what's interesting is you
when you talk privately to officials in Japan, you get actually two kinds of stories. One story is, well, we have to go ahead, and we're special. You can trust us. We've experienced nuclear war. Why would we ever want to get weapons? You know we won't. So that's one line. But then there is a more interesting line, which is, we're going ahead. What is your justification for going ahead? Well, they come up with arguments like, well, we spent so much money already, we have to keep going, which is not an argument at all. But when you press very, very hard, they snap and they say, well, maybe if we go ahead, the whole world will see what not to ever do. And you then are asked questions about, has your government made any effort to try to reach out and explain its view? And I think it's a plea. We have not responded as well as we could to that plea yet. And it would be unfair to say that we haven't responded at all. But I think we have not responded as clearly as these people, who I think are pretty well placed in the government, are asking to be spoken to. In the case of South Korea, it's quite interesting. They clearly want to go ahead as well, and not just a little bit because of Japan. When I asked someone very senior and close to the president, would you reconsider if Japan reconsidered? The answer wasn't yes or no. It was, is that possible? Which I thought was very interesting. Note well that when they heard the argument about Japan being special, they exploded. I mean, they didn't see, well, we're special too. You know, come on, give me a break. In the case of China, very interesting. They complain about Japan. They have these wonderful reports, very complete, quite good, about how Japan's move for reprocessing is an option for nuclear armament. You have to worry about the rightists, and on it goes. And then you say, well, if you're worried about them, don't you understand that we might be worried about what you're doing? Oh, well, we would only do it for peaceful purposes. To which it's pointed out, well, but that's what the Japanese say. And then the room gets silent. Almost 3 minutes after that conversation in Beijing with ministry officials, I then was asked, you know, it would be useful if we had reports on how much this cost. I said, why? I said, well, the people higher up may not be as familiar with what the facts are. I said, why not? He said, well, they listen to the French. And the French give them cooked numbers. So for what it's worth, the NGOs are trying to get reports done and have, sending them to China. I don't think that is a constellation of interests that suggests this is hopeless, but rather it's ripe. In the case of the United States, we could not plead for not doing the closing of the fuel cycle because we were kind of playing with it, at least in the executive branch, by having light items to fabricate mixed oxide fuel that has plutonium in it. That was zeroed out earlier this year. Now, Congress has delegated this important strategic issue to the energy committees. Does anybody know what energy committees used to be? They called them Energy and Public Works. Do you know what that's code for? Pork. I mean, let's be blunt. So it's that much of a strategic issue that we delegated to the energy committees. There have been no hearings in the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, Foreign Affairs Committees on either side. That seems odd. For all the reasons that Mr. Oehler pointed out, we claim we care about East Asia. You know, it could be you hold a hearing and decide, nah, not an issue, we're going to let them go ahead. We haven't even done that. I guess we're waiting. Now, I'll close with an upbeat note. You're always supposed to end on a positive note. What would happen if we did pause? Well, according to the Energy Department, our fabrication fuel effort down Savannah River would be substituted with something else. We would save, apparently, some tens, if not scores of billions, depending on who you believe. but it won't be zero. In the case of Japan, at least 100 billion. Ditto, China. So you could save money, you could make friends. I don't know, I guess that's just too good to be even attempted, isn't that it? I mean, we can't even fail at this. I think we need to try, and I think that's the purpose of this panel, is to raise this issue set. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Henry, and thanks to the speakers for sticking very closely to the allotted time for your opening remarks. I see there's an incredible amount of brain power in the room. Many people who have experience working on these issues. So we look forward to any questions that you might have. Any hands? Sure, right here.
I wonder whether anyone here could give us a sense of what sort of elite debate may go on in Japan and China on these issues. And if you were to press the pause, who would be on our side?
And real quickly, can you identify yourself?
I'm Edward Levine, former Senate committee staff member and now chair of the board of the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation.
I had a series of meetings in Hawaii, Singapore, and Washington. And officials from the key countries came and advisors came. And I think in the case of China, there are very sensible engineers who are worried about one of the plants they're building breaking down. They are focused like a laser beam on trying to make sure there isn't a failure, an accident. And there are even some people in the regime that understand that Chernobyl was one of the keystones for the collapse of the Soviet Union because it raised questions about the integrity of the regime, which claimed it was interested in safety, but apparently, well, not really. So there's that. I think also in China, there's an increasing interest in making sure that numbers like 100 billion don't go south on you. I mean, they have a need for money such that rises to the level of interest if they thought that was going to be a waste. I'm going to China. I'm planning to go to China this fall. I was asked to give a paper by the Chinese on the history of the Clinch River breeder reactor, which I know something about. They don't. I don't know if it'll make any difference when we hear that history, but both you know the history. So that's China, I guess. I'm trying to be upbeat. The others, you have to worry, maybe they got bribed. In the case of France, you have to worry that, I mean, I had one fellow who's the head of the breeder program, just retired. He had a chart showing energy demand requirements for uranium out to the year 4000. And I said, you know, this isn't in my interest, but I'm going to give you a little help here. Don't show that chart. It doesn't make any sense. He says, why? I said, we're not gods. We're barely human. Don't do that. 20 or 30-year mortgages, that's the output. That's it. No further. So some of this is not, you know, really having a market economy where you can fail so simply. I mean, it's sociological. In the case of Japan, I think there are people that worry about the anti-nuke sentiment, and they would like to perhaps partition the question of the reactors from the reprocessing, saying, well, can't we be for opening up some of the plants without having to buy breeders that don't work, reprocessing that loses money? And they see a possible opening. However, loyalty in Japan is quite a phenomenon. It goes well beyond anything I understand here. And I barely understand what it is in Japan, so it's a problem. But that works to your favor if we are candid to the leadership and not say, well, if you should change your mind, we would back you. No, 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 a little bit more direct. And why? We don't explain why. In the case of South Korea, it's pretty much whatever they get, we want. If they don't get it, we don't need it. And to their credit, they're quite clear about that. I hope that answers the question.
Gordon, did you want any comments on that? Right here.
Yeah, Stephanie Cook with Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. A couple things I wanted to ask you about. One is in Japan, the extent to which the politics of Amori Prefecture play into this, and the threat that they would return the spent fuel. We are focused more and more on the problem of spent fuel pool crowding, not just in Japan where it's a real problem, but in Korea, and also most recently in our most recent issue, China. And the interesting thing in China is that they are shipping the fuel to the Gansu province, which is way, way in the west. It takes them 4 months to make a shipment, and they can only ship tiny amounts because they only have 3 casks to transport fuel in. At the Gansu, there's like this little tiny pilot project that hasn't operated since 2010 as far as anyone could tell. The talks with Areva, it's not clear where they're going because they're apart on money and what Areva would actually do. And I'm not clear on what reprocessing is actually happening in China, so if anyone can provide clarification on that, I would appreciate it. And I agree with what Henry says about, South Korea. We get the feeling more and more as they focus on the problem of spent fuel pool crowding and where to put this stuff, that the reprocessing is kind of this weird sideshow, but it's also a place to park the fuel. And in China's case, it's a weird place to park it because it's so far away from where the reactors are.
Can you restructure what the questions are? Just make sure.
Sure. So there were a number
of questions.
Yeah, so my question is, what is the evidence of any reprocessing going on in China right now, number one? Number two, what is the extent to which threats by the Amori Prefecture governor to return the spent fuel to the utilities plays into the government's kind of refusal to move on the subject? I mean, are they frightened of this? And that's about it, really.
Mark, did you want to start on what reprocessing are the Chinese currently engaged in, and then maybe Henry, if you want to take the Amori question.
Okay, well, it's working. It is working. It was working.
There you
There we go. So we're not aware of any Chinese reprocessing, but Henry, maybe on his last visit, saw something. I did go to Japan in October and had a lot of very extensive meetings with the government diet members. It's mostly about safety regulation, but the entire issue in Japan of the nuclear policy is, of course, very, very big right now because of still the after effects of Fukushima accident. It's almost universally agreed that any new nuclear reactors in Japan are politically completely impossible, and the difficulties we've seen since even my visit turned out that it was absolutely right, that nobody's taking responsibility for restarting the reactors, and therefore that's why so few have been restarted, even though it is official government policy. And then as far as the Amori Prefecture and reprocessing, that's absolutely right as far as we could tell. That Japan really isn't a box. At the moment they were to ever hint that Rokkasho might not actually start, that's the reprocessing plant in Japan, then all kinds of dire consequences would occur politically all across the country, and it's impossible for them to say right now that they're not going to do it, and yet it continues to be delayed and delayed, so it's really hard to say what's going on. It just happens to be delayed right now just beyond the automatic renewal date of the Japan-U.S. Peaceful Cooperation Agreement in 2018, so it's just who knows what's going on is, I guess, the bottom line.
Yeah, let me add a couple of points. First, I would refer you to Frank von Hippel's site for discussion of what the 50 metric ton of heavy metal capacity plant is doing. They claim that they've reprocessed a grand total of 24 or 5 since 2010. They need French technology, it looks like. And this idea that, well, they can do it themselves, well, yeah, they can, but look. When I talked with the people in the reprocessing program, they said, well, we get the money for the plant, but we don't get the money to run it. And running it is really hellacious because things happen when you turn the thing on. It's prettier if you just don't turn it on. When you turn it on, all sorts of things happen. So that's point one. Point two, the 5-year plan, which talks about reprocessing in a sentence, says 2 things that mildly go in different directions. I talked with someone who was Chinese, because I don't know Chinese. What did it say? He gave me a literal translation, and he said, we should examine the reprocessing question and proceed to construction. I said, well, if you examine the question, what's the question? Is it the technology or the cost? He said, it could be either. I said, well, doesn't that undercut the when you proceed? He said, well, yeah, I mean, this is not clear. So I don't know what that means. And then finally, on the more prefecture, I think it's useful to remember. I talked with someone who makes a good deal about the local politics. And they said, well, it's obvious that this is absolutely inevitable, that they're going to have to run it because. I said, well, what about this delay? An additional 3-year delay occurred last fall. Was that because they consulted the people in Murray Prefecture? Oh, well, everyone knows that that was going to happen. I said, wow, not anybody I know, maybe only you. I think the national government has the capacity to override things that we do not appreciate, and it has already happened. And I also think that the one great contribution of modern Japan to Western civilization, besides the Walkman and so many other things, is the creation of what's called economic zombies. And we don't really appreciate this till we travel on Japanese airlines. They're wonderful. They're entirely money losers in many respects, but they're supported by the state indirectly. There are a lot of different ways that the concerns of the Mori Prefecture economically could be solved when you consider they will lose $100+ billion if they operate. That is a lot of money to play with. I am confident that the Japanese can figure this out without our help.
Other questions? We have till about 1:15. Sure. Right here.
Hi, Gene Verjoy with Senator Markey's office. I'm curious to hear more about how Japan's recent elections might affect the questions that we're discussing. As for anybody who's not aware, the ruling party actually just captured a supermajority in parliament, which opens up the possibilities of reforming the pacifist constitution, which has been a long-time goal of Prime Minister Abe. Obviously, the issue of Japan's military role in the world and its nuclear potential are intimately linked, so I'd be curious to hear the panelists talk about that a little bit.
So we're all Japan.
Yeah.
Gordon, do you want to try that one?
I really have very little to offer. Maybe you said something. I've been following it from an economic standpoint and the problems they're having in the economy and the increase in value of the yen, when in fact the whole idea of that about Abenomics was to have it go down. So all I can see is the tremendous economic problems they're coming up with, and they aren't doing they aren't getting anywhere with all of these policies that these great thinkers like Ben Bernanke and others assume is going to work. And I just think with all of their debt problems, they're not going to spend a lot of money in things that don't relate to that debt problem.
Let me pick up on that. There was a LDP task force on waste, and they put a man in charge who actually had a chip on his shoulder about the Rokkasho facility. I don't know if anything will come of that, but it is cross-cutting in a less than helpful way if you're supposed to cut down waste and you have this project that has a hard time justifying itself economically. There's another thing, which is, and I think, Gordon, your comments go to it. If they have an agenda of dealing with economics, maybe the role of women in the workplace, constitutional reform, there's a limit to how many things you can push before you wear out your welcome. And the idea that they can press all the buttons and get success doesn't sound right. So you have to ask, how high up is reprocessing? Not opening up the plants, that may be high, but reprocessing on that list, I don't think it's very high. And these other things are going to take plenty of political capital to move. That's just my hunch.
Well, it certainly, that was the first thought I had this morning also. Say, well, what does this mean for the Japanese nuclear program? Because obviously the LDP is the pro-nuclear party. They are the party that created the whole vision of a closed fuel cycle for Japan, coming from the original crisis, Arab oil crisis in the 70s, where it was portrayed to the United States as being a matter of national survival that Japan have reprocessing capacity, which eventually led to the U.S. granting reprocessing rights, which we completely controlled all the material in Japan because of the definitions that I talked about earlier. So we gave them reprocessing rights. That was the LDP. Now, to the extent right now that Abenomics and the economic policy is focused on reprocessing, is probably true. That is not their number one priority. In the energy area, their number one priority is to restart the nuclear plants. But for being a number one priority, they have to, politically, they have to pretend that they have nothing to do with it. So there's literally no politician and no, at any level in Japan, national, prefectural, local, and the nuclear regulator that will actually claim to have the power to allow a nuclear plant to restart, even though that is the national policy. And the restart is very important for Rokkasho because the Japanese are sensitive to the criticisms that their plutonium stockpile has grown and grown. And of course, if they were to reprocess in Japan, the reprocessing in the past has almost all taken place in Europe. It would grow even more because they have no plants operating right now that can draw down that stockpile. And they have two reactors that were ready, the Takahama, which are the two that the court blocked. And those were going to use so-called MOX fuel, plutonium fuel. So unless they can get a few of those going, and right now that's not happening, but that could be the first step. That with this election, maybe they'll feel a little bit more emboldened to take some responsibility for some of these restarts and try to get them to happen. And that would be presumably one step toward clearing away some of the criticisms of starting Rokkasho.
Is there a question?
Just a geeky question. What process is Japan using to reprocess? And would it be the same process that the French would sell to the Chinese?
In a word, yes to the last question, and Purex to the first.
Okay.
Roughly.
So the significance of that being, of course, that's the process that is more easily able to produce pure plutonium, although Rokkasho is designed to produce a mixture of separated uranium and plutonium. But
actually, I put a Purex plus, which is if you know subtraction, you're there.
But again, the Japanese do point out, if you ask them, they say, we're not producing plutonium, we're producing a mixture of uranium and plutonium. Whether that makes a big difference as far as proliferation resistance would be a matter of debate.
Yeah, I would say debate, yes. Because if you go to the weapons labs, and you talk to people, the barriers that used to exist between whatever that mixture is and usable weapons material has gone down. And it has gone down because of weapons design, and it has gone down because things that are now public about what you can do. So this is the reason why when you read the Chinese and they're breathless, they're not wrong. And why the South Koreans say, yes, you can make bombs out of that, and we don't say no. In fact, I think Mr. Biden was quite eloquent recently. What did he say? They could make them almost overnight if they chose to. So, anyway, he's not a weapons lab guy, I get it, but I think he got briefed.
We'll come back to these.
Sure
just to
thing,
see if
yeah.
anyone
No, I
else-
don't want to hog the gloves.
Yeah. Okay, so.
I have two questions. One is a technical political question about the legislation, which I don't quite understand. And that question is, when you talk about U.S. origin uranium or U.S. origin fuel in Chinese reactors and our rights over that, given that they get most of their uranium from Kazakhstan and other countries, I'm not quite sure where all the conversion and enrichment takes place, but is it that if they ran it in a Westinghouse supplied reactor, then it becomes U.S. origin?
Well, I think,
Correct.
yeah. I mean,
Okay.
the way the law reads, I should say the treaty reads.
It's Article 6.
So what does it say? It says U.S. origin spent fuel is either fuel from the U.S. or fuel that has been generated in a U.S. reactor.
It's nuclear material transferred pursuant to this agreement, so that would be uranium, presumably. And nuclear material used in or produced through the use of material or equipment so transferred.
Yeah.
So that gets to the use of any uranium from anywhere in the world in a reactor that is supplied by the United States, or, and then this is the question mark, what is the definition of that? Because
Yeah, that's-
we're transferring this technology. This is the AP,
1000.
Westinghouse AP 1000 technology, which was already occurring under the previous U.S. agreement before the last November. And the agreement with Westinghouse was that they agreed to transfer the technology with certain commercial intellectual rights retained to Westinghouse. But as they go through the iterations, the agreement also said China can develop a larger version, which is now the CAP 1400, which they are building, which they could then export under certain agreements. And then, of course, the technology transfer agreement also calls for China to take over more and more of the production and knowledge of the production of these reactors. So at what point does that technology no longer become U.S. origin or control? And that's one of the reasons for the request for a DOE definition.
Is there not one now?
There is no known explicit definition. I mean, there's a lot. So the best example of this happening in the past is France. So France started off with a Westinghouse licensed design, and in fact a joint venture, which is called Framatome, French-American Atomic whatever, which is now REVA. So it was a joint venture. At some time in the 1980s, and I actually tried to run this down, but there apparently was never any kind of ceremony or official declaration or anything else that France had gone through enough iterations of its own, generations of this technology that no longer was U.S. controlled technology. But it clearly became the case because now France can export all over the place without any U.S. say whatsoever.
Where this really becomes important is, let's say you're trying to sell a massive copy of Rokkasho to the Chinese and you're French, and you're dickering over price. It would be useful to know, what can we reprocess? What doesn't require U.S. consent rights, this safeguard stuff, whatever, and what does? And depending on how you define what U.S. origin technology is and what a U.S. reactor is, it could be almost everything or almost nothing. And the price probably would reflect that as what it is. Might be useful to know what the answers are.
Yeah. May I ask the second question?
Sure.
But
And then-
if you want to get somebody first, that's fine.
Sure, and then right after, maybe we'll take two
Sure.
of them if you want to, Stephanie, and then Ed, go right ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you, you talk about, and it's very interesting that it's sort of hedged, complaining about from the U.S. officials like Tom Countryman about, we really don't like it, we would prefer if you didn't do it. Do you think that in a new administration, dare I speculate and say it's Hillary Clinton's administration, and you can tell me what you think about a Trump administration too, if you want to hazard a guess. But the question is there going to be any? I can't understand why the language is so couched. And secondly, what effect does this business of our supporting India's membership in the NSG? Where the real concern is that if they get the full membership, among those who don't want to give it to them or who are sitting on the fence about it, one of the big concerns is that this will give them access to advanced ENR technology, reprocessing and enrichment technology. And so if on the one hand we're allowing this or pushing to allow this for one country, where they are really building up big plutonium stockpiles, and on the other telling these countries, I mean, doesn't there need to be some meeting of the minds over this and some coordination of policy if we're going to be really strong on this?
Stop asking rhetorical questions. I mean, look, but I mean, more generally, we're kind of hoping that the next administration will pick up the ball. And if it's Trump, who knows? It could be that he changes his mind. But he has sounded rather tough about getting something, that nobody should get something for nothing. You should get a deal. And the idea that you would automatically renew something without extracting something, I don't know. That's not the art of the deal that I remember. And he seems, for some reason, not to like Japan. I mean, so there's that. If you go back to the archives of the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center, there is a fellow, Bob Einhorn, who speaks up. And he says he thinks that people in the past have been plutonium alarmists. He's always dismissed them, and now he says he's become one. Mm-hmm. And if that's true, what did he do for Secretary Clinton? Oh, he was the advisor on the Iran deal and on other things. Mm-hmm. Could he possibly still be relevant? Don't know. But, I don't think if I was Japanese, I would assume that an election will solve this problem any more than it will solve it for the French. It could be either way, at least.
Ed, and then the final question to gentleman in the back here.
We have an issue here that, from our standpoint, is primarily a strategic issue. Yet most of the argumentation is related to energy economics. And going back to China, do any of the strategic weapons and non-proliferation community there pay an interest? Do people like Li Bin or Deng Lishun have any views on this? Is there anyone in their defense community who watches this and might be sensitive to the problems that you raised?
Hold that, and then we'll take the final question. We'll take them both together.
Yeah, actually, my question is kind of related to Ed's. Steve Rademacher, with the State Department now. I've been thinking through the presentation you've heard here, and it sounds to me like the linchpin of your suggestion is really Japan, because they're the ones that are moving forward most quickly, and if you persuade them not to, then the other pieces would fall into place. You're shaking if I'm wrong about that.
Actually, it may be China first.
Okay. Well, let me ask my question. If you're the Japanese, like, what's in it for you to do what you're suggesting? What I'm hearing, the main thing that's in it for them is that China won't match. Will not match what they will not acquire their own corresponding capability, which is useful. But I mean, compared to the situation today where China has reprocessing capability and has, in fact, nuclear weapons. The idea that if Japan creates that same capability, then China will match the Japanese capability. I can see where the Japanese might think, well, they're still coming out ahead because compared to the status quo, compared to today, it's not going to be that much worse, and in some ways it's going to be better. So my question to you is there something else China can offer to sweeten the deal for Japan, to make it more attractive for the Japanese to want to do?
I don't know that you need to sweeten, but explain.
So those final two questions on the table, and if the speakers have any final comments as well. And maybe we can go down the line if you want to start, Henry, and then we'll go.
11 tons is what they currently have on their soil. That's 11,000 kilograms divided by roughly 5. That's a lot of weapons. It's more than we. So they want a weapon. So we know how the story begins, but if they get into production of 8 tons per year, how does it end? Very unclear. In the case of China, there's a debate. They have hundreds. Some say 200, others say 900, but hundreds. The bottleneck is opening up a really massive reprocessing plant. They have enrichment, way too much, but they don't have any plutonium capacity, really, and not much of a stockpile. This would fix that. It's interesting, they're not so interested in using it in light water reactors. They want to stockpile it for 10 or 20 years for a breeder. How convenient. If you do the math, that's 15 to 30,000 weapons worth you get before you have to load everything in there. That's quite a threatening overhang. So for all parties, the question is, do you really see this to be in your interest? In the case of Chinese, I talked with people who at least advise the intelligence community and the PLA. You never really, it's like wizard of Oz over there. You very rarely get to talk to the horse's mouth. But one of the things that they do worry about is Russia. If they go down this route, will they be prompting more Russian attention? And the big question is, how much can we do to kind of push back on the Russians? So that's one thing they might be interested in, with regard to tactical weapons in particular. In the case of the Chinese, they have a complaint against Japan. They would like nothing better than that not go forward. In the case of Japan, frankly, if everyone could hold their breath, they're sitting pretty. If they go forward, they are buying into a lot of uncertain futures. What's the rush to get it wrong? Can we just take a break for a while? It doesn't preclude going crazy and doing stupid stuff later. But if you can get a pause now, I'll tell you what the value is to the Japanese and to everyone. Right now, if you go ahead and you reprocess for commercial, peaceful purposes, no foul. You get a pause, even for a week, and you break it, you get a bell, you get a signal. So it's worth something strategically. You know, arms control isn't just for the altruistic, it's for the military planner as well, in this case. So that would be my apology. I don't know how useful that was for them. I'm looking at
You say, are you actually talking about like an agreed pause?
Oh my God, no, we shouldn't have any agreements. How about just simultaneous policy announcement? I mean, you don't need a treaty. I mean, you say that, and my God, the whole room melts down in legal, brain aneurysms. Please, let's not go down that. If the countries announce that they are delaying or deferring, that's good. That's the story. Because then when they go ahead, it's, oh my God, they changed their mind, and there's something that's changed. I don't know that you need a treaty. Gordon.
I believe that this reprocessing can be a significant proliferation problem. However, my head hurts when you start dividing 5 into however many tons you want to talk about. There's no country that's going to want that. I think what you have to say is it can provide a cover to provide plutonium for a number of nuclear weapons that you think you need, but nobody's going to think that you're going to use all of that in a nuclear weapons program. It reminds me of some of the early days in the strategic intelligence estimates. We had models of the Soviet forces and their weapons, and we had models of our forces and weapons, and we kind of did a net assessment for these estimates of how many times each side could destroy the other side. And if you came out with 10 and they came out with 20, well, you lost. So those kinds of things don't make much sense to me. But the cover for doing a program does, and that's what you have to consider.
Do you buy into this argument that the Russians make, that they're serious about getting tactical weapons?
Absolutely.
Okay, now let me ask you a question. What was the American requirement for tactical nuclear weapons when we really believed in
You know, I don't know the answer to
it?
that
Oh,
question.
but I do.
Oh, good. I suspected you did.
This is a field full of amateurs, but when an amateur actually gets into it, this fellow actor, Eric Schlosser, he does something all the experts don't do. He reads. And that book is remarkable. It has so many interesting footnotes. One of them, Command and Control, says that the Army in 1956-7 had an Army Chief of Staff testify in closed hearing that he only needed 151,000 tactical nuclear weapons. We settled on 7,000 on land and 3 at sea, so that's only 10,000. But those aren't hundreds. That's still a pretty big number. If we get into that, I mean, I don't know that we will. Let's hope we don't. But if we get into tactical nuclear weapons to deal with the Russians, maybe not us, but maybe the Chinese, holy cow, the numbers could go up.
Okay, but you will know that over time.
Oh, you will. Let's not find out.
Mark, final.
I would just add one more complication to the equation, and that, of course, is that China is a weapons state under the Nonproliferation Treaty, so it actually does have the recognized right to make weapons grade plutonium, and really, as far as I know, not under any arms control restrictions on how many warheads they can make, so that is another factor.
Important point.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming this afternoon and joining us for what I hope is a very robust and informative discussion. We look forward to continuing to be the Arms Control Association with whomever is interested in trying to get a grip and a handle around this very important and potentially dangerous issue and situation. So thank you so much again to our speakers for joining us and for all of you coming this afternoon.